Vicky, what a treat to chat with you. I have to confess right up front, this comes from me being a huge fan of yours. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, I knew of you for a long time, but really got to know the depth of your work in recent years. I would say COVID years. And my respect for you and my fan appreciation for you continues to grow. So I have so many things I'd like to chat with you about. I'd like to start with, how does one growing up in the UK as you did, going to great schools in the UK, how do you get the bug and think about, I want to investigate. I'm curious. I want to write. I want to hone my skills, and I want to be a journalist. Is that, in fact, the path you chose a long time ago, or did some accident take you down this path?
The answer is yes and no. You're right. I had a very privileged life in the UK. I went to very good boarding schools, and I did always love writing and reading, and I was always good at it. And I particularly remember, my English classes when we read To Kill a Mockingbird. I'd never been at that point to the US. I'd certainly never been to the South. I remember scenes from that book when Atticus Finch is shooting the rabid dog. You could feel the heat. You could feel what Alabama felt like. It took you back in time. I think literature did make me curious. And, I also studied, when I was at Cambridge, I studied a lot of German literature, Italian literature, French literature, and American literature. But I really didn't know what I wanted to do. It was actually my father, who was in finance, who really gave me no choice, because I sort of suggested to him, as I was about to graduate Cambridge, having majored in English literature, that perhaps I go to law school. And he said, well, this is the first I'm hearing of it, so I'm not going to pay. I don't think you're serious. He said, I don't know why you just don't go and write. That's what you like to do. So you should go do it. But it's one thing to say that, and then it's another thing to make a career of it. I think one of the differences possibly between becoming a journalist in the UK and becoming a journalist in the United States is that it's much scrappier in the UK.
Scrappier in the UK.
Yes.
The UK press has a reputation for being a bit rabid. And
well, it does, but it's not like the US, where, there's a sort of well-trodden path from Yale journalism school to the inner sanctum of the New York Times or the Washington Post. That's not how it works in the UK. And, it took me quite a few stops and starts. And, I actually started out being the junior secretary to the chairman of Condé Nast in the UK. And it was the most boring and therefore the worst job I've ever had, because typing was too grand. But I then moved to be a really scrappy job. I was then the assistant to a man who wrote a really terrible gossip column, which on a tabloid owned by Rupert Murdoch that's now defunct, called the Today newspaper, and the column was called The Insider. It was so bad. It was nicknamed The Outsider, and my boss was a raging alcoholic. But the great news about that was that he would go to lunch every day and get so drunk that I learned how to...
baton in the afternoons.
I learned how to tidy up his words. I learned how to lay out the page. I learned how to write the headlines. And when ultimately he fired me because he was, very cantankerous and drunk, the managing editor of the newspaper said, don't worry, your future is very bright. He, on the other hand, is going to have liver problems. The way we were trained in England, they call them diaries, but they are the equivalent, if you like, of page 6, except that they exist in the broadsheets as well as the tabloids. And in fact, the best training grounds for young, hungry journalists are the diaries on the Times, the Telegraph, the financial pages of the Telegraph, the London Evening Standard. Those are the places where a lot of young, bright journalists would gather. We weren't given jobs. We were put in competition with each other. We were paid by the day, and we were each sent out at night. The theory being anybody can cover a train crash or a plane crash, but it's much harder to walk into a room full of people that you don't know and find the story. The reason that turned out to be actually really great training was that, again, the UK is so much smaller than America that it meant by the time I was 24 or 25, I had built up through going to all these events, whether they were book parties or events at the Houses of Parliament or theatre openings. I had got a Rolodex that meant that I could write in depth about almost anything. I knew enough people in every sphere.
First of all, you're one of the few people who still refer to a Rolodex, like I do. And,
right?
And you mentioned the difference between tabloids and broadsheets. And in a simplified way, tabloids are one-folds that the New York Post, the Daily News, those kinds of newspapers who would tend to be a little bit more sensational, a little less in the serious journalism, versus the broadsheets would be the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, papers that we would know here. That would be the broadsheets, which would be less sensational, more in-depth, more serious journalism.
Yes, although I think that there is still a difference. The back in the day, I mean, it's changed now, but the British press is still colloquially called Fleet Street because originally all the newspapers, broadsheets and tabloids, were all on Fleet Street, near the City of London. The broadsheets to this day would consider themselves to be the British broadsheets would consider themselves to be more accurate than perhaps some of the tabloids, but there is still the sense of competition between all of them. Yep. There is still a race to be first, and the broadsheets take that just as seriously as the tabloids, whereas in this country, there's a sense of it being a sort of calling, being like a priesthood almost, not just a job. I think in England, journalists consider themselves to be doing a job, an important job, but they don't have the same sort of view here. I think if you work for the New York Times and you make a mistake, that is taken far more seriously than it would be in the UK. I'm not talking about the kind of, when I say mistake, I'm not talking about phone hacking or anything unethical like that. In England, the most important thing is to be first.
You have this interesting job where you just walk into a room, invited or not, I'd suspect, and you had to find the story. That obviously shapes your professional skills. And you say by that age, you had a Rolodex, a set of contacts that allowed you to write about a really broad range of topics. And you had sources and knowledgeable people in each of those areas that you could call upon. What does it do to your personality? I'm suspecting it shaped your personal skills a lot. I suspect you were not a flamboyant, outgoing kind of person, but you learned to manage your reservations to become a very effective journalist.
Jim, I think you're right. I think it made me fearless. First of all, I realized that everybody in this world has a story to tell. Sometimes they may not know what it is, and it's the job of a journalist to find it.
Bring that out.
And pull it out of them, because we are all walking, breathing stories. My husband, we got married very young. I actually met him. He was a journalist too. He then moved to the business side of the newspaper he was at, the Telegraph. We were moved to America by the Telegraph's then owner, Conrad Black. He was going to do venture capital. He was going to see, Silicon Valley had started. He was looking at investing in really digital properties.
You moved from London to where?
To New York.
Uh-huh.
And I was pretty established in England. I was pretty well known. My byline was pretty well known at that point.
And you unplugged from that network that you had built up And also,
Exactly.
you're untethered, and now here you are in New York.
Yes, and in some ways it was terrifying, the thought of having to start all over again. And in another way, it was very liberating, precisely because the UK is so small. I had gone to Cambridge University, so had my father, so had my uncle, so had my grandfather. And so when I got interviewed for various jobs, they were like, "Oh, yes, we know you, we know your dad." In America, there's none of that. You live or you die by how good you are, and really nothing else matters. And I thought that was fantastic. I really thought that was a challenge that was irresistible. But my ex-husband, it was his company that was sponsoring us. So I didn't have a green card for the first 2 years. I had a visa that I could work for a British paper. And so
actually do that?
Yeah. So I did for the first 2 years. I mean, it was a very good education because the British, particularly then, and particularly this particular newspaper, had a view of America that was sort of, Americans are different from us, and they wanted me to go and find stories that highlighted those differences, and also find sort of washed up former British celebrities who are at this point kind of living in a trailer. And as a result, I traveled. I got stuck once at the Arctic. I mean, I must have been to there are very few states in this country I haven't been to, because the other thing I discovered was that the middle editors, who were the ones assigning me where to go, had a very bad, poor idea of American geography. So they thought, they'd say, "Oh, just get to Arizona," and assume that was like driving 2 hours,
like going to Manchester.
Yeah, it's exactly. So it meant that I saw a huge amount of the States, which was a great education. The problem was that everything I wrote was through a British lens. I actually had a deal with my then husband. I was like, we had decided that he got 2 years, and then after 2 years it was my go, and I got to choose where we would live, unless he out-earned me by so much that was just crazy. and
You're a negotiator.
yes. So the 2 years came up, and it coincided with my green card coming through. And as that happened, the phone rang. It was a guy called John Podhoretz, very well-known conservative critic, who was then the number 3 editor at the New York Post. And he said, "I'm told that you know how to sell this newspaper to women. Will you come in and talk about it?" For the next 18 months, I wound up actually being the features editor and the news features editor. I created longer reads at the front of the paper, and I got to know Rupert Murdoch, which was very interesting. And one of the things I will say about the New York Post that's very different from the British tabloids and even the British broadsheets, other than the Financial Times, is that Rupert took business news very seriously. I remember when AOL and Time Warner merged. I was at the paper, and the New York Post put that across the first 8 pages of its newspaper. It was in the front. Wow. You would never have that, a business story, never have that in England. And I think it speaks to the different cultures. And Rupert Murdoch taught me something very important, which is that you can't be a really good journalist in this country, in America, unless you understand money, unless you understand how it works, and unless you're able to write about it in a way that your readers understand. I discovered a lot of people read the Post, yes, for page 6 or for the politics. A lot of people whose other read is the Wall Street Journal. A lot of business people read it for the business pages, which really were going through a transformation when I was there.
And that merger may have been the pin in the balloon of the dot-com bubble.
Exactly. Well, so here's the funny story. Given my background, was always interested in deep dives and longer reads and really big investigations. And so I said to Lachlan Murdoch at the time, I'd like to do a magazine for the dot-com billionaires. And he said, the new rich, all these people were making all this money. And he said, that's a great idea. Do a dummy. Whilst that was in progress, the new rich very quickly became the new poor.
And not so rich.
Yeah, so that would have been a terrible. It was also during that period of time that Tina Brown, who had then left The New Yorker, had just started her new magazine, Talk. She used to get terrible coverage in the Post, particularly in the business pages by the media columnist. Every week she'd have to read how dreadful the new issue of Talk was. So she very cleverly invited herself in to lunch at the New York Post with the senior editors, and then went round the lunch table and said, so who runs which section? And the next day I got a phone call. She said, I would like you to leave the New York Post and be my deputy editor. It was a very, very clever on her part. She became one of my closest friends and remains one of my greatest mentors.
Well, let's dig a little bit there, because before you said you learned to be fearless. I suspect that's not entirely the case. And I suspect that from your work on Chasing Ghislaine. Because you recount in the early days how Jeffrey Epstein, a character I was fascinated about, how he was trying to intimidate you, and you were feeling it. You're a young mom with twin boys at home, and you were feeling the pressure, and you weren't feeling particularly backed up by your editors at that time. So I've heard you described as a ferocious journalist, a tenacious journalist, a relentless journalist, and yes, fearless journalist. But I suspect you're not fearless. I suspect you've learned to manage the fear. You felt the anxiety, you felt the fear. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Tina Brown and how important she's been to you professionally and personally. I suspect you have a pretty good network of gal friends who are your refuge and your support system.
I do. In fact, we call ourselves the Coven. I don't know which one of us came up with that nickname, but during COVID, we are all Brits. 3 of us, I think, have become Americans who've built our careers in New York. So we're very grateful to this city and to this country. All of us may have gone to Cambridge. I think one may have gone to Oxford. We come from similar, we understand each other very well culturally, and we are all, I'm going to say immodestly, very successful in our different spheres, and we all understand the price. We're all parents. We all understand the cost that having a successul career comes with. I mean, when you talked about fear, it's interesting. We all have vulnerabilities. My vulnerability, and I'm not ashamed to say this at all, is my children. Somebody can come after me all they want. Like, come after my children. And, I turn into Tiger Mom. I mean, and that was true when I was pregnant with them, when I first encountered Jeffrey Epstein. It was true years later when I sort of brought up the wrongs as I'd seen it that had happened during that period of time. It was true when I wrote about, I took on the administration, when I wrote about Jared Kushner and his foreign policy and sort of appearance of self-interest.
I love, you while you're a very serious journalist, I love that you get cheeky too. And I love Ivanka.
Yes. And so, there have been times. I had a death threat recently where the police were called. My message to my kids is, go about your lives, but just if you ever see anything strange, just keep, be careful. But I would also say this: there are much braver journalists than me in the world, and there are people who do much more dangerous things. I think one of the great weapons, it was interesting. I talked once with a Russian journalist called Andrei Soldatov, who is extraordinarily brave. He independently takes on the Russian intelligence services. That's his beat. And
Wow.
his father, interestingly, was the work for the Kremlin and put the Kremlin on the internet many years ago. So he has a complicated story, but he said to me, you know, he's been hacked, he's been taken to prison, and he's had his apartment ransacked. He said that the great thing about social media is that you're no longer alone. None of us are alone. And the minute that you sense something is off or troubling, you tweet about it. You know, particularly he was saying, you know, back then in Russia, when they want to make an example of one, if sort of everybody knows what's going on, it becomes less frightening and it becomes less of a threat.
Let's not make any mistake about it. You cover the worlds of business, of money, of fame, of celebrity, where they intersect. That's where you go on your beat. And that can be dangerous. It's maybe not as dangerous as covering wars on the front line, but it has its perils. And I think the number is 55 journalists lost their lives last year. So yes, you can. It's good that you have a support group. It's good that social media gives some transparency and some overlay protection. But you do have to be conscious of the fact that you're going to shine a light on some cockroaches, and at times they're not going to be happy about it. And certainly in the last two series that you did on Audible, Chasing Ghislaine and Kushner Inc., you angered some very important and powerful people.
Yes. So I would say, you know, one, I am careful. I shred my notes and my material. I don't leave it lying around in the garbage. You know, I live in a building where everyone is very protective of me. They have some idea of what I do. You know, I would say, yes, I have, you know, I have written on these controversial subjects, and I've highlighted the appearance of corruption, absolutely. And the people involved don't like that. But having said that, if anything was to happen to me, probably investigators would know where to start looking.
Consequences.
I'm in plain sight.
Yes.
And that's a huge advantage.
Well, let's talk a little bit, Vicky, about the career side of things. The world of journalism, you mentioned how different it was in the UK than when you came here to the US, how you had to change your perspective on your career and the things that you did. You've had some unbelievably exciting adventures. You're curious, that's as obvious as can be. So, and the fact that you said early in our conversation today that everybody has a story, even if they don't know it, and that you'll always look for those and probe those and pull those out. But the world of journalism has changed dramatically since that story appeared on 8 pages of the New York Post of the merger of AOL and Time Warner. The idea was very sound. Its timing and its execution, certainly questioned. But the idea that traditional media worlds and digital worlds were going to merge has obviously been proven to be the case. And that's had consequences on how you approach your career. We had a conversation another time where you told me, here you are, you're head of a family, the provider for the family, and you worked 6 months like a dog, day and night, on a story that you found intriguing, and indeed the world found intriguing. And you worked hard on that for all of those 6 months with nothing else going on. And you got paid an enormous sum by a magazine for that in a couple of $20,000 or $25,000. And you said, oh my goodness, this economics doesn't work for me anymore. So you explained how you start to have to think differently as a gig economy worker, as a journalist, a freelance journalist. That is, you have relationships, but no single payer anymore, no single employer, as most top journalists don't. But you have an idea for a story, and then you have to think about, if I spend that much time on the story that I think my public would be interested in, I now have to think about, how do I monetize that? Is there a magazine story there? Is there a book there? Is there a audio series, and you have a multi-year deal with audible.com? Is there a documentary? Is there potentially a feature film? Is there a book? How will this play on my Substack platform? So you now have to not only be this ferocious, tenacious, fearless journalist, you also have to be Vicky Ward, the business manager, the time manager, the entrepreneur.
100%. And I think, as you, in fact, I was reading, I think Dylan Byers talking about the New York Times and the journalists who have been leaving there to do what I do for economic reasons. I mean, I'm very lucky. I am a known quantity, and I think it would be harder for someone young and unknown
a brand
to do. Yes. So I have a brand. I have my Substack, Vicky Ward Investigates, and that becomes the intellectual property that I own. And then I decide which of those newsletters, as you say, should be as worth a conversation with Audible and they think would be worth a podcast series, which of those might be suitable for a documentary, and it's possible they might work for both. And then which of those would, as you say, would be worth a book or a magazine article. And, I am thinking about time and money. Time is money. You're a very successful businessman. You know this. And I think that a lot of journalists for a long time, before we came into this, the dot-com world, they had these well-paid jobs that they could sit there and do for life and really not think about money. That is just not the case anymore.
You'd be reasonably compensated. You weren't going to get rich, but you're doing something you like, and you never had to worry about the paycheck and what the balance in the account was. So you wouldn't get rich, but you would
you could survive.
But that's gone now, right?
That has gone. The opportunity for much better economics is there in a way it has never been before, particularly because audiences have changed. They now follow
have choice.
They follow people. They don't follow these platforms.
So the power is shifting from the platform to the individual journalist. But it seems to me you have two decisions as this new journalist business person that you are. That is the kernel, the story, the idea that gets you excited, and you think, boy, there's something there, and you start poking at it. So now you're deciding how much time I spend on that, and at the same time you're doing the calculus in the background of if it develops like I think it will into this idea, this story, how do I think about monetizing that in the most effective way?
Exactly.
And do you therefore say, great idea, but at this point in time, I have to allocate my personal resources, my energy, my time, my talent? That seems to be the toughest decision.
So here's where the fearlessness bit comes in. You know very quickly whether or not something has got legs, whether there is more
commercial viability, that is depth of story, that is character development.
And you know, exactly, you know very quickly that whether the stories that may have been out there about this, whatever topic it is, have just scratched the surface, that there is a much bigger story that has many more layers underneath that. The real question is, can you get it? If I think an idea is great, and I'm pretty convinced that there's a lot out there that has not yet been uncovered, I have never worried who else is doing it. Will I not get there? I've just gone for it.
I suspect Chasing Ghislaine was one of those, because everybody had written about it. And as my wife would quickly tell you, I read James Patterson's book some years ago called Filthy Rich about Jeffrey Epstein. And so when the Epstein story broke, my wife was saying, how do you know so much about this? Have you ever met him? I said, no, I've never met him, but I'm intrigued by this story, having read James Patterson's work, where frankly he hired a couple of really terrific journalists to help him flesh out that story. But I was always reading all those stories as the story unfolded in the media. And I said, no one is really telling the thing that I'm most interested in is the money. How did he actually get the money? What did he do? How did it, all of a sudden he has a $60 million brownstone just a couple of blocks from my first flower shop. How did this happen? And then when you did your series, your book, and which became the Audible series, Chasing Ghislaine, I said, this is it. But you had to be in the midst of that, dealing with exactly what you just talked about, which was so many people were writing about it, but you knew you were going to the essence of the story that would appeal to crazy people like me who really wanted to know the details on what happened.
Well, I also knew I was in an advantage there because I knew that I'd kept all these notes
from 18 years ago.
Yes, and that gave me a huge head start in knowing who to call.
You knew the characters too. You knew the personality. Yes.
I wasn't that worried about thinking that I could tell a different story on that one. Believe it or not, on the Kushner book, the White House is something that, there are hundreds of reporters covering every day. That's their beat. And
hundreds of reporters who think they're at the top of their game. I mean, they got to it.
Right.
And here you come around the outside saying there's another story here. You had Michael Wolff write his insider's recount. Yep. You say, I'm coming from a different approach. And you started in New Jersey with Grandpa Kushner and how he built this empire, and then what Charles Kushner did, and how the insights you gave into the family, the dynamic, the motivations, the impact of religion. It was just really a deep dive, but you went around the outside of the White House and in the back door.
Yes. And I also think, Jim, that what I thought I had that I didn't think the other beat journalists had that would prove really helpful. My book prior to that one was about the world of New York real estate. It was about the history of the General Motors building. Right.
Also terrific work. Again, the intersection of characters, wild personalities, criminal activity, money, fame, the center of New York. I mean, it was, the Liar's Ball was just terrific work. You get at it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, but because of that knowledge that I had of finance and real estate, as you know, my first book was about Lehman Brothers. I sort of knew that a way to look at, I had a perspective on this family in the White House that the Washington reporters, for the most part, were not looking at it. They were not looking, they didn't have the contacts that I had in the world of New York real estate, who were all busy.
Which would include a man who went on to be president.
Yes, but all the people around Trump, the businessman, remained around him in this White House, and all the people around the Kushners remained, around the Kushner business. Everybody's feeding at this trough, and that was why I knew that I could tell a story that would be different. But it was scary. You always need. You need to find a way in. You often, in business stories, in fact, in a lot of stories, most journalists know this, we go to the lawyers, because the lawyers are people who often feel very underappreciated. They feel they've done all the work. Sometimes it was the lawyers who came up with the brilliant idea, even for the transaction. And yet
no money down to buy the GM building, maybe.
Right. But they're not the ones who get the glory or the fame. Yep. They're not the ones who get the really big payout. And
they're papering the transaction.
Right. Yes. If this is something worth writing about, they also think that maybe they can help their client by controlling the narrative a little bit. So you, as a journalist, you always want to make the lawyers your best friends. Now, what that says about the legal profession, I don't know.
Now, when you're writing the Kushner book, do they know you're writing the book while it's in process?
100%, because I do view myself as non-partisan. I am a registered independent, and I actually really believe that journalists who do the kind of work that I do, very, very investigative, really need to have clean hands.
Yes.
And I really want to hear everybody's point of view.
Did you want to speak directly with Jared and Ivanka? And
absolutely. I have known Jared and Ivanka.
And that's what I was suspecting from being around New York. You have personal relationships. I don't know. I don't know that you've spoken to the president, the former president, but during this process, because I know he's sort of dismissed you in the press.
Well, then he also had a long conversation with me during the transition. It was actually a very nice conversation.
Funny how he didn't remember you then just a couple of years later.
Well, the thing about Donald Trump, as we know, is that in the same way he has a love-hate relationship with Maggie Haberman of the New York Times.
And I was thinking of that while you were saying that, because what we've all read in the last couple of weeks, that he barely knows her, but according to others, he was the main source.
Right. So the thing about this president, and he makes no secret of this, is that if you're a journalist who is relevant, he wants to engage.
He'll have time for you.
Yes, because the one thing he will never ignore is a platform. And, the reason he spoke to me in the transition, he'd watched me on television. So I've been watching you, and it's sort of like a moth to a flame. That's just who he is. So it doesn't really almost matter whether he's saying nice things or bad things. The point is he's saying the things. And in fact, I did reach out to him after he left the White House. I didn't speak to him, but I did get an answer to the question I was asking. When
you did the book on Kushner, Chasing Ghislaine, you unearthed a raging battle between two legal titans. Mm-hmm. And have you kept up with that evolution of the story?
Yes. I saw David Boies 2 nights ago. Boies Schiller, the law firm he founded, had its 25th anniversary party. And so it was very interesting to see him and this firm that he's built and that has been under controversy recently, because a lot of people have left. I am absolutely keeping tabs on it. I think I know both men, David and Alan Dershowitz, really quite well, known them for a while.
And you have both respect and fondness for each of them. So it's interesting to see how this is playing out.
Yes. I mean, the thing that will happen first that's very much tied into the battle is Virginia Roberts, now world famous, probably Virginia Roberts, for being...
And you had a hand in that.
The irony of Virginia Roberts, who I have obviously since met, was that back in 2002, when I very first met Jeffrey Epstein and I was really dealing with him and his stupid threats, it was the fall of 2002, which is the exact time that Virginia, unbeknownst to me, ran to Thailand and got away from him. If only I had known that at the time, I would have been able to include it in my article, and history might look very different. But obviously, as we know, she eventually came forward and has been critical, and she's got, she plays a critical role in this battle between these two legal titans. Yes.
When you published that book and did that work, we were left on the cliff's edge, wondering what will happen with someone who you were friendly with in the UK and maintained a casual relationship with over the years here in New York, in Ghislaine Maxwell herself. What do you make of what's happened since?
I shouldn't be shocked that she didn't pay her lawyers, and yet I am shocked she didn't pay. I mean, I know. I think what you may be referring to. She's been moved to some Club Med of a prison in Florida, right?
But she's still in prison, and for a long time.
Yes. No, I'm not shocked about that. I still think that the men in this story, and there are a lot of them, who were just as culpable, but what they did do was create this sort of socioeconomic pyramid to enable Jeffrey Epstein, and they absolutely, I think, knew what they were enabling. And that seems to me to be really wrong. You know, Ghislaine Maxwell clearly did some terrible things, but it's almost like she's paid a price for everybody else who's vanished. And that does seem to me to be, honestly, a failing of our legal system.
But it's also what you predicted.
Yes.
Because you covered this world and you know what powerful men and money and fame and those intersections look like. It's the recurring theme of everything you prod at every scab you try and pick off, is to expose the underbelly of those intersections.
Yeah.
So that leads us to, what are you working on now?
Gosh, well, I'm working on several things at once, as always.
Not surprised.
I'm in the middle of, so my Substack is actually, we're going to start amping
and
that
it's called
up.
Vicky Ward Investigates on Substack, and people could and should subscribe to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Yes, I'm going to start amping that up because I'm going to, people have had the option to go free. I'm soon going to make it. People really have to pay for the best stuff. I have been, to my astonishment, I've been covering the trial of Tom Barrack, a billionaire friend of Donald Trump's, but who's been accused extraordinarily, actually, of not just not registering as a foreign agent, but actually spying for the United Arab Emirates. And last week, the former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, testified on behalf of the government. And it was a very puzzling testimony because Rex Tillerson could barely remember Tom Barrack and had no knowledge of any of this. So you were left wondering, well, what was the point of that? And the government is due to wrap up, I think, by Monday. My understanding is the defense is going to put on a hell of a defense. I'm amazed that no other journalists are giving it airtime.
I'm amazed that I'm not following this either, because it's your beat. It's power, it's money, it's politics, it's intrigue, it's all of the above.
Well, and it's the Middle East, which is obviously what Jared Kushner was all about, his foreign policy. I have been writing and following that in depth, and there is more to come. At the same time, I am making for Audible, and we've wrapped up the reporting. This is really exciting.
I love that you do it in your own voice.
Well, we're making a series about the Federalist Society. And many people may ask, what is the Federalist Society? The Federalist Society explains how power in this country really works. It explains why this current Supreme Court is made up of 6 conservatives, 5 of whom are members of the Federalist Society, and 4 of whom went to Yale Law School. So what we have done in this podcast series, which will be out next spring, is really tell the story about a pipeline of power that starts at Yale Law School. Because the Federalist Society was formed 40 years ago by 3 Yaleys at Yale Law School. And we've interviewed those people.
How many presidents have gone to Yale?
That is, but you know what? One of the professors at Yale gave me the statistics of the people who go into incredibly high office from this tiny, tiny law school is extraordinary. So disproportionate.
There were a couple named Clinton.
That is
named Bush.
Yes, exactly. There you see, with that on the top of your hat. But what we've done is take 4 current Yale law students, 2 members of the Federalist Society, 2 not. And we've told the story of how isolated they feel. They're aware of how this pipeline of power works. They're in it. And sort of what they feel about it and what they feel about the process of being at Yale Law School. And so in a way, we let them be the narrators and humanize what would otherwise be quite a wonky subject. And then we take it back in time to the 3 Yale law students who would be in their shoes, but 40 years ago. And the interesting thing, Jim, I've tried to balance both sides of the argument.
I see it here. certainly the Federalist. I see movie, I see documentary, certainly a big best-selling book, which you just seem to crank out with great ease. And I know it's not easy at all, but I just marvel at you and your professional career and how you go after these things. And yes, it's of interest to you and how it's your life's work in terms of context and all sorts of bubble up at this. I think we're going to, I hope we get to enjoy more time where we get to discuss the things you're interested in, because now we can sit back and watch this evolve through your eyes, reading you on Substack and other publications that you print in, because now we can follow you as you follow the story. And I think the days of, okay, I'll do all the work and then bang, it happens. It seems like in the Kushner story and the evolution of the MBS-Jared relationship that you focused on there, the Epstein story, Ghislaine rather, where there's more to be told of that story. I think as fans, readers, and consumers of your work product, we get to take that journey with you, and it'll have different plateaus where a documentary will come out, your book, or the follow-on. The world has changed, and we get to walk with you. And boy, you have some big shoes for us to follow in.
Jim, that's so nice of you.
But I just get a kick out of your world and how you go at it. There's so many things I'd like to drill down on when we get a chance to chat again. I think earlier on when we were talking about your group of friends, the coven, as you call them, I think that's so important for all of us. We talk about and write about all the time relationships, how important they are to us in our lives. And at the end of the day, we know that no matter what successes we have in terms of our day job or what successes we have in terms of any of our pursuits, at the end of the day, we measure ourselves and we can detect and determine our degree of success and happiness based on the depth and breadth of relationships we have. And I think so many of us can learn lessons from you about being deliberate, about maintaining that network and having those wonderful relationships, because it gives you the chance to overcome fear, and it gives you the chance to be bold and to be the journalist that you are. And I frankly don't think the term journalist is a big enough and broad enough term to describe you and what you do.
Oh, well, I very much appreciate it, Jim. And I'm not going to disagree with any of that. I think that at the end of the day, all of us, I mean, you're this very successful businessman, but it only matters in the context of more important things, which are fundamentally the relationships, the people you love and love you and have your back and you have theirs. I mean, that's what comes first.
So we started out to learn about your career in journalism, and lo and behold, we learned about a wonderful person and the importance for her and for all of us in terms of the value of the relationships we have. Thanks, Vicky, for being generous with your time and sharing so much. We look forward to having this conversation often.
Absolutely, Jim. Thank you so much for having me.